So if we really want to understand the nature of the body, what we really want to look at is the cells. When we look at the body, we perceive it as a one whole. The reality is the body is actually a community of anywhere of up to 70 trillion cells, individual cells making up the body. And why this is important is if you understand that the body is a community, then you might understand that the health or characters of the body are related to the nature of the community of the cells that you're comprised of. The human body is made in the image of the cell. We didn't get any new functions by having 50 or 70 trillion cells making up our body. What we just did was elaborate on the functions that every single cell already has. The relevance of this is that we can study cells, and by understanding cells, then have an understanding of the human body, because the human is based on the cells that comprise it. We are not controlled by genes. Well, this opens up the doorway then to how does biology actually work? Because we already, for the last number of years, just bought the dogma without even questioning it. We just bought it. Now it's time to question. I know that there's some people out there who are still saying, genes control biology. I know there are people out there because we live in a world where the media is talking about genes and biology every day. Well, I want to remove that thought from your head by this. The nucleus of the cell is where the genes are. And since the belief was the genes control biology, all the genes being in the nucleus make the nucleus the command center of the cell. So what does that tantamount to be? Well, I told you, remember cells and people have the same functions and systems? Where we have organs in our body, the cell has organelles, which mean diminutive organs. So I look at this relationship and I say, look, if the nucleus is the command center of the cell, then that would be tantamount to the brain of the cell, because it controls what's going on. So this all of a sudden says the nucleus, which contains all the genes, would then control biology as much as the brain controls your life. It's so far pretty acceptable, and all scientists would agree. Now all of a sudden comes the next question. What happens if you take the brain out of any living organism? Death. That's required. I mean, since the brain coordinates and keeps life functioning, taking the brain out would result in death of the system. Okay? Here's the important problem. The problem is this. If you take the nucleus out of the cell, it does not change the behavior of the cell. Some cells can live 2 or more months with no genes in it at all. And that doesn't mean just sitting there like a lump. The cells are moving around, they're eating food, digesting it, building their body, going through all the normal physiology, respiration, digestion, excretion. In addition to that, they recognize other cells, involve themselves in communication with other cells, can recognize predators or toxins and avoid them. Basically, what I'm saying is this. There is no change in the behavior of the cell after you remove all the genes. There's only one conclusion you can come to from this, and that is genes are not controlling biology, because the control is still there even though the genes are not present anymore. So the question all of a sudden says, now we must start from afresh. We never questioned the dogma. Since 1953, it seemed so correct when Watson and Crick said it. We just bought it. But now the answers of the Human Genome Project come out, and they challenge us, and they say, how does biology work? Let's start off with the cell. The cell is a living organism, has all the same systems that we have. The foundation of the cell is protein, because protein are the molecules that give rise to the structure of the human body. The proteins are grouped. They're grouped into functions. Proteins that are associated with digestion are grouped with digestion. Those with respiration are grouped with respiration. This is a protein construction of a protein that is important in all of our bodies. It's called calmodulin. Like all the other 100,000 different proteins, this protein has a very unique shape. Underneath the surface of this three-dimensional model, you find that there's a skeleton. And in fact, molecular scientists call the skeleton a backbone, which of course is an interesting word when you think about it in chiropractic terms. Now here is actually the secret of life, because this is what makes life from inanimate life. That if I change the electrical charge on the protein, I cause the backbone to change its shape. So if you want to see, this is the actual movement of calmodulin in the body. And what it represents is a flexing of that portion of the amino acid chain that responds to an electrical field. And all of a sudden you see life, animation, came from this molecule. By changing the electrical charge on a protein, I change the shape of the protein. So built into every protein is a motor. The motor is the ability to change the shape. The only problem with this picture right here is it just runs all the time. And this is a problem because life has to have things start and stop, functions begin, functions stop. You have to regulate it. You just can't have proteins running all the time, so we have to add something more to our proteins. This is a model that shows a signal, a chemical signal that will bind to the protein. There's no behavior, not at all. But now here comes a chemical signal. And the chemical signal in this case has a charge that will bind to that certain site on the protein, and when it binds, causes the movement of the protein. When the signal disconnects, the protein stops. You can regulate protein functions like with a key, the key being the signal. By adding the signal, you can activate a function. By taking away a signal, you can stop it. Just add the key again. As soon as you add the key, the function will start. Signals can bind to the protein. And in conventional allopathic medicine, all signals are molecules. There are also, more importantly, energy signals. Energy is 2 orders of magnitude or 100 times more effective in controlling the proteins than are the chemical signals. So energy is a much more effective way of controlling the system. So basically it says you are a protein mechanism, and the signals turn on and off and regulate the pathways of proteins that control your biology. What we need is control of the signals. And this is where the important part of the program comes from. It says this: it's not just signals and proteins, but you want to engage the proteins in right sequences. You want digestion to occur before the respiration process occurs. You want all these processes to be lined up in a sequence. Therefore, you must regulate the signals. Well, what regulates the signals in the human body? The nervous system and the brain. The cell possesses a brain that regulates the signals. Are the genes the signal regulator, yes or no? No, because you could take all the genes out and you still have all the regulation. So it says, guess what? If you can remove the nucleus from the cell and the cell is still functioning, then by definition, the genes in the nucleus were not the brain of the cell. So all of a sudden it says, so where's the brain of the cell? The brain of the cell is the membrane of the cell. The membrane of the cell is the skin of the cell. Now, don't think this is too far off from reality for the human for this reason. There were 3 germ layers that make up the embryo. They were called ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. These were layers of cells in the early embryo that gave rise to all the tissues and organs of the body. Each layer gives rise to only very specific things. The ectoderm gives rise only to 2 things in the human body: the skin and the nervous system. So basically, taking it back and recognizing that the skin of the cell, the membrane, is the nervous system, is not out of alignment with what we find through the rest of biology. So how does it work? The cell membrane is the skin of the cell, and it separates the environment from the self. Underneath your skin is self. Above your skin is the environment. Okay? The proteins are present inside the cell. So inside the cell are digestive proteins, respiratory proteins, excretory proteins, etc. But where do the signals come from? Well, the signals come from the environment. And why this is important is because in order for the signal to affect the protein, the signal has to interact with the membrane. And at the surface of the membrane, there are specialized switches. There's a switch right there at the surface of the membrane, and the switch is to see the signal from the environment and then send a signal into the protein, which then creates behaviors. Understanding that switch is important. Why? That's the switch that controls biology. And so let's take a look at this switch for a second. Okay? The switch has main function is this: to recognize the primary signal, which is the environmental signal. And once seeing that signal, the switch generates a secondary signal, which is the one that goes and activates the